a sealed letter, a serpent-shaped pin, and a death too tidy to be natural. Welcome to Cipher Trails. Tell me, where in the world are you joining Holmes and Watson today? Your presence here adds brilliance to every twist we uncover. Now then, let us begin. It was on a chill October morning, the sort that painted the windows of Baker Street with pale condensation, that I found my friend Sherlock Holmes in an uncharacteristically pensive state. The fire crackled weakly in the grate, while outside the clatter of hooves and muffled cries of newspaper boys lent the usual symphony to our corner of Victorian London. Holmes sat cross-legged in his armchair, his long, slender fingers steepled beneath his chin, and his eyes, piercing and unreadable, fixed not on the morning paper, but on a small ivory pin resting atop a velvet cloth on the table between us. It was shaped like a coiled serpent, delicately carved, its beady eyes inlaid with some dark mineral, perhaps onyx or obsidian. At a glance, it appeared to be no more than a trinket, but I had long since learned to trust Holmes's instincts when he gave any object more than a passing glance. "You observe, Watson," he said without turning, "that the pin has not been polished in several days. See here, the grime at the base of the coil, and yet the engraving remains crisp. It has not been in regular use. That alone suggests a recent resurrection from neglect." "An heirloom," I ventured. "More than that, a piece with a history, and I suspect, a very dark one." At that moment our landlady, Mrs. Hudson, announced a visitor. The man who entered was neither flamboyant nor threadbare, but of the sort whose quiet presence suggested authority tempered by exhaustion. He wore a heavy wool coat, the collar slightly askew, and carried a walking stick with an ivory handle, a curious match for the pin on Holmes's table. "Mr. Holmes," the man said with a bow, "my name is Colonel Geoffrey Elmhurst. I've come to you with a matter that Scotland Yard has dismissed as domestic nonsense. But I believe, it may be far more serious than that." "Please sit, Colonel," Holmes said, rising with sudden energy, "and tell me precisely what nonsense Scotland Yard has chosen to ignore." Colonel Elmhurst took the chair opposite and removed his gloves with stiff fingers. "It concerns my late brother, Quentin Elmhurst. He died just over a fortnight ago, officially from heart failure. The doctors were satisfied, but I was not." "Go on," Holmes urged, lacing his fingers once again. "Before his death, Quentin sent me a package, by private courier, not by post. Inside was only this," he gestured toward the pin, "with a note that read, 'The serpent lies coiled beneath the hearth. Guard this well, Geoffrey, lest the fire burn anew.'" I raised my eyebrows. Holmes, however, seemed neither surprised nor puzzled. His eyes narrowed slightly, like a cat watching a hole in the wall. "And what was your brother's occupation?" Holmes asked. "A historian, formerly a professor at King's College. For the past 3 years, he had been researching the private archives of the Earl of Darlington. He'd become, obsessed, really, with an old family scandal. Something to do with the Napoleonic Wars, he said. I thought it was mere academic indulgence." "And this note, did he say anything else? Any further correspondence?" "Number nothing. And 3 days later he was found dead in his study. The door was locked from the inside. No sign of struggle. Only the fire had burned out, and a faint trace of smoke clung to the chimney breast." "Was there an inquest?" "Brief. The verdict was heart failure. He had a history of angina, it seems." Holmes nodded slowly. Then he stood and retrieved the scarf pin, turning it in his long fingers. A family scandal buried in an archive, a cryptic message, a serpent beneath the hearth, and a man dead behind a locked door. "Yes, Colonel, I believe you were right to come to me." Elmhurst's lips tightened. "I must add one more detail, Mr. Holmes. 2 nights ago, someone attempted to force open the drawer in which I kept the pin. My manservant interrupted them, but the intruder escaped." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Indeed?" Then we must assume the serpent has not yet uncoiled its full length. Watson, prepare your bag. Colonel, would you object to our visiting your brother's home in Kensington this afternoon? Not at all. I shall arrange it. As the colonel departed, Holmes turned to me with that rare, almost boyish gleam of delight that accompanied only the most challenging cases. Come, Watson. There's more in that fireplace than ash, and I intend to find it. The colonel's cab had scarcely pulled away from Baker Street when Holmes vanished into his bedroom with the ivory pin and did not emerge for the better part of an hour. The clink of glass vials and the subtle hiss of his Bunsen burner informed me he was conducting some sort of chemical test. I contented myself with my notes, reviewing the colonel's account, and attempting to discern what Holmes might already suspect. At last, he emerged, slipping his coat over his shoulders, with a briskness that signaled our imminent departure. "You've found something?" I inquired. "A trace of old resin at the base of the coil," he said, slipping the pin into a small leather case. "It has been affixed to something recently, possibly wood, and the discoloration near the tip suggests exposure to prolonged heat. Ash and oil residue, very faint, as though it were placed close to a fire, but not consumed by it." I raised a brow. "You think it was hidden in the hearth?" "I think it was removed from it shortly before Quentin Elmhurst's death. The question is, what else was there?" The colonel's residence was in Kensington, a fine, sombre townhouse on the corner of a leafy avenue. A manservant, hollow-eyed and tight-lipped, received us with a bowed head and led us through a corridor lined with oil portraits to the late Mr. Elmhurst's study. The room was as the colonel had described: dark wood panels, a Persian rug, shelves crammed with books in English, French, and Latin. A great desk stood by the curtained window, and beside it the fireplace, stone-faced and empty now, but bearing the soot stains of long use. Holmes approached the hearth at once, crouching before it and running his fingers along the stone. He removed a small magnifying lens from his pocket and inspected the inner cavity, then produced a pocket knife and gently tapped the underside of the hearthstone. "Watson," he murmured, "come look." I knelt beside him. At first I saw nothing unusual, but then he pointed to a thin scratch, barely visible, trailing from the inner edge of the hearthstone to the leftmost wall tile. "Someone pried something loose," he said, "and recently, by the freshness of the mark. Look closer." He handed me the lens. Beneath the faint scratch lay what appeared to be a flake of dark wax, pressed into the joint between two tiles. "A seal," Holmes said, "broken in haste, perhaps, when the pin was retrieved. We are not dealing with a mere token of sentiment. This pin was concealed as one might hide a key, or a warning." He stood and glanced toward the window, which faced a secluded courtyard. A narrow footprint was faintly visible in the dust just inside the sill, too small for a man's boot and shaped like a slipper. Holmes turned sharply. The window was used. Someone left or entered shortly before the death was discovered, and not by force. Either the victim let them in, or they had the means to enter quietly. The manservant, who had lingered at the threshold, cleared his throat. "Begging your pardon, sir," he said. "Mr. Quentin often worked late into the night. He kept the window unlatched to air out the fire smoke, even in the cold." Holmes nodded absently. "Your name?" "Terence, sir. I've served the Elmhurst family for 22 years. Did your master entertain visitors frequently?" "Not of late, sir. The only one that I know of these past weeks. A young lady, about Mr. Quentin's age, came once, maybe twice, dressed plainly but very neatly. She brought him a parcel. Books, I assumed." "Did you catch her name?" Terence hesitated. "Miss Rayburn, I believe. A student or a writer, something of the sort. I didn't hear much more." Holmes's eyes lit with interest. "Where did they speak?" "In here, sir. I fetched tea and left them be. She stayed for less than an hour." "And this was how long before your master died?" "5 days, sir." Holmes turned to me. We shall require Miss Raeburn's whereabouts and access to the Earl of Darlington's archive, if it still holds Quentin's notes." "One moment," Terence said, reaching into the desk drawer. "This may help, sir. Mr. Quentin left a journal. The police never took it. Said it had no bearing. He always kept it. Locked up. But since you've come—" Holmes accepted the small leather-bound volume with reverence and opened it to the first marked page. The handwriting was precise, each entry dated. Holmes scanned it silently, then handed it to me. One passage caught my eye. "The ivory serpent has reappeared. It was never burned, as I believed. Raeburn's letter confirms it passed through 3 hands since 1812, each ending in suspicion or ruin. If I do not send it to Geoffrey in time, it may well devour me, as it did the others." Holmes took the journal back, tapping his fingers on the cover. "A legacy indeed, and not a benign one. There is a chain here, Watson, serpent-shaped, yes, but with each link forged in secrecy. If we can follow it back to its origin, we may yet understand why a mild historian died in a locked room with a cryptic note and a sealed fireplace as his final testimony." I glanced toward the hearth, now cold and dark, but feeling somehow charged with hidden meaning. Holmes turned to Terence again. "You mentioned a parcel. Did your master receive any other correspondence? Unusual letters? Packages, perhaps?" Terence shook his head. "Only one letter came the morning before he died. I never saw the sender, but the envelope was thick, parchment, not paper. Smelled faintly of oil and something sweet. I took it up to him personally." "Did he say anything after reading it?" Terence frowned. He burned it straight away. "Not a word, sir." Holmes's gaze drifted once more to the fireplace. He crouched and sifted the ashes with a gloved hand. At last, he retrieved a sliver of blackened paper, curling at the edge. I leaned in to see, but the writing had been almost entirely consumed. Only a fragment remained. "Still you. Do not dig further, lest burn again." Holmes slipped the scrap into his notebook and rose. "Come, Watson. We've seen what we can here. Now to track Miss Raeburn, and a serpent with far too many fangs." We took our leave of the house, the cold air of Kensington pressing against us like a silent accomplice. Holmes was quiet as we walked, his thoughts spinning visibly behind his narrowed eyes. "Quentin's death was not random," he said at last. "It was a message. But not for the Colonel. Not even for Scotland Yard. It was for me." I started. "You?" "Not by name, no, but the manner of it. The locked room, the token, the half-burnt message. It's a puzzle, and puzzles, as you well know, Watson, are not sent to be buried. They are sent to be solved." It was late afternoon by the time we returned to Baker Street. The autumn sun had dipped behind the tall roofs of Marylebone, casting long shadows across the pavements, as if the city itself were lowering its brow in contemplation. Holmes did not speak during the cab ride. He sat with his arms folded tightly, the journal resting closed on his lap, and his gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the misted windows. Upon arriving, he went straight to his desk, spread the journal out beside the sliver of scorched paper, and lit a fresh lamp. I poured us both a cup of tea, but Holmes waved him away, brushing his fingers instead across the pages like a pianist preparing for a difficult recital. "Raeburn," he muttered. "That is our next movement. Find her, Watson. Somewhere between the cryptic letter, the serpent pin, and this woman's quiet visits lies a truth the Colonel is not yet ready to hear." "And yet," I said, settling across from him, "there is still no clear evidence of murder. No violence, no intruder seen. Only a dying man, a locked room, and a pin with a melodramatic reputation." "Precisely why it fascinates me," Holmes replied. "When death presents itself without drama, but with design, that is when one must look hardest." He rose suddenly and moved to the small cabinet beside the fireplace, retrieving the thick leather volume of Bradshaw's Directory. Leafing through it at speed, he paused briefly at the R's, then jabbed a long finger at the entry he sought. "Raeburn, there are 6 listed. but only one matches the age and circumstances Terence described. A Miss Lydia Rayburn, resident of a boarding house on Oakley Street, near Chelsea Embankment. A writer, according to the registry. Let us hope she is both present and willing to speak. It was already dark when we arrived at Oakley Street. A light fog clung to the lamplight like lace, softening the corners of the gaslit buildings. The boarding house was modest but tidy, its windows aglow and the scent of supper wafting faintly from within. The landlady, a sharp-chinned woman with an apron perpetually dusted in flour, answered our knock. "Miss Rayburn," she said, glancing at our calling cards. "Top floor, left-hand door, but I'll warn you, she's had a shock. You'll do no good pressing her." "Fear not," Holmes said. "We shall proceed with all delicacy." The stair creaked beneath our steps as we climbed. At the top, Holmes knocked gently. A pause, then the door opened a cautious inch. Miss Lydia Rayburn was younger than I'd expected. No more than 30, with clear grey eyes, a pale complexion, and a ribbon of washed-out blue tying back her hair. She regarded us warily. "Yes?" Holmes bowed. "Miss Rayburn, I'm Sherlock Holmes. This is Dr. Watson. We come not on behalf of Scotland Yard, but at the request of Colonel Geoffrey Elmhurst. May we come in?" She hesitated, then nodded slowly and stepped aside. Her lodgings were modest but refined, books stacked in neat piles on every available surface, a small desk by the window cluttered with papers, and a framed photograph of an older man in academic robes, presumably Quentin Elmhurst, resting beside an extinguished lamp. "I knew you would come eventually," she said, once we had seated ourselves. Her voice was soft, but not timid. He said as much in the letter. Holmes leaned forward. "You received a letter from Mr. Elmhurst before his death?" "Number after. 3 days ago. I found it slipped beneath my door with no return address. Only my name written in his hand." She reached into a drawer and produced the envelope. Holmes opened it delicately. Inside was a folded sheet of cream paper upon which were written just 4 lines. "Lydia, burn what you hold. Trust no one, not even Geoffrey. The scarf pin is only half the truth. If you see Holmes, tell him it was never mine to keep." Holmes handed it to me, and I read the lines with growing confusion. "You knew about the pin?" She nodded. "Yes. Quentin showed it to me a week before he died. He said it had been passed to him through his research, linked to a family scandal involving the Earl of Darlington during the Regency. He believed it was more than just an artifact. He said it was part of something larger, a pact, a legacy that had claimed lives in secret for over a century." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Did he mention names? Dates? Documents?" "He kept notes, diaries and references from letters written during the Napoleonic campaigns. He was trying to trace the object's movement, from a military officer who disappeared in 1812, to a judge who was later disgraced, and finally to a clergyman who vanished after inheriting it, all connected to Darlington House. And you have these notes." She hesitated, then crossed to her desk and produced a stack of loose papers. "He gave me these in case something happened. He said someone had begun watching him, a man in a long coat, always smoking, who never spoke. Quentin said the man was after the pin, but not for its monetary value." Holmes examined the papers swiftly, his fingers dancing across references to the Darlington Pact, the Ivory Covenant, and repeated symbols, an Ouroboros, a coiled serpent eating its tail, linked to various dates and names. "Fascinating," Holmes murmured. "Quasi-Masonic. A secret society, perhaps, masked beneath a facade of inherited tokens, or merely the delusions of a man too long immersed in dusty archives." "I don't believe he was delusional," Lydia said quietly. "Quentin feared what the pin represented, but he feared even more what would happen if it were passed to the wrong hands. That's why he tried to send it away." Holmes looked up from the papers. Did he mention how it came into his possession? A parcel. No return address. Just the pin, wrapped in muslin. He said it had been delivered anonymously, but he knew it came from the Earl's private collection. He'd seen it once during a cataloguing visit, though it was never officially listed among the archive's holdings. And this Earl of Darlington? Dead. The current Earl is his grandson, Lord Simon, I believe. Lives mostly abroad. The house is seldom used, but the archive remains under trust. Only approved researchers are allowed access. Holmes sat back, the threads in his mind clearly drawing closer to a weave. "Miss Raeburn," he said, "you must not remain here, alone. Have you noticed anyone unusual in recent days? Anyone who might have followed you?" She hesitated. "2 nights ago, I saw someone across the street, standing still beneath a lamp, watching my window. When I looked again, he was gone." Holmes stood. "Then we've no time to waste. Watson, we shall escort Miss Raeburn to a safe lodging tonight. Afterward, I intend to pay a visit to an old friend at the British Museum who owes me a favor concerning family crests, particularly ones shaped like serpents." I rose at once. "And what of the Earl's archive?" Holmes's eyes flashed. "That, dear Watson, shall be our next step, but not through the front door. Some legacies are too carefully guarded to yield to ordinary inquiries, and I suspect this one has had a guardian for far too long." The following morning broke grey and listless, as though the sun itself had withdrawn behind the curtain of mist that clung low over the rooftops of London. Holmes, already up and meticulously dressed, was standing by the window of our sitting room, his eyes fixed on the slow-moving carriages outside. On the table beside him lay a folded note addressed in spidery, slanted handwriting. "A response from Sir Hector Stanmore at the British Museum," Holmes said without turning. "He has agreed to receive us privately. It seems the Darlington family crest, particularly its unofficial iterations, has been of quiet interest to antiquarians for some years. Serpent symbology, hidden orders, the usual trappings of inherited secrecy." I sipped my coffee and set aside the newspaper, which reported nothing of note save a burglary in Knightsbridge and a scandal at the opera. "And what of Miss Raeburn?" I asked. "Safe for now. She's taken lodgings in Hampstead under an assumed name. Mrs. Hudson's cousin owns the property. Discreet. She'll be undisturbed." "And the Colonel?" "He remains unaware of how deep the waters run. For now, that ignorance may serve him better than knowledge." By 9:30, we were rattling toward Bloomsbury in a hansom, the fog thinning slightly as the sun began its slow crawl toward noon. The British Museum loomed out of the haze like a temple of silent memory, its stone steps damp with dew. Sir Hector Stanmore, a lean man with a voice like crinkled parchment, received us in his book-lined office with a courteous, if distracted, air. "The Darlington crest," he repeated, adjusting his spectacles as Holmes handed him the serpent-emblazoned pin. "Most curious. Not the official arms, of course, but I've seen similar designs in private collections, usually appended to documents concerning the so-called Darlington Compact, a rather shadowy arrangement made during the Regency era." "A compact between whom?" Holmes asked. Sir Hector turned to a filing cabinet, drew forth a leather-bound ledger, and thumbed through its yellowing pages. "Ah, here we are. The compact was reputedly an informal alliance, entirely extra-parliamentary, between certain noble houses and select military officers. Ostensibly, it was intended to ensure the protection of Britain's moral legacy following the Napoleonic Wars. In practice, it appears to have been used to quietly suppress scandals that might embarrass the Crown or its allies." Holmes leaned forward. "And the ivory serpent? A symbol of vigilance, perhaps, or secrecy. It appears in marginalia beside 3 correspondences I hold on restricted access, and 1 diary entry written by Sir Giles Darlington himself." He opened a drawer and retrieved a facsimile. "Listen to this," Sir Hector said, Reading aloud. The burden passes again. To place it beneath fire is to silence its tongue. But it will rise, coiled and cold, should the wrong eyes find it. I've sealed it behind the arch, as our father did. God forgive the oath we swore in 1812. Behind the arch, I repeated. Not a metaphor, Holmes murmured. He means a physical location, a literal arch, possibly within Darlington House. Sir Hector gave a small nod. That would align with folklore. There's mention of a hidden compartment in the Great Hall fireplace, where the lords of Darlington conducted private rituals during the Regency. Nothing substantiated, of course. Holmes closed the facsimile and pocketed the details with swift precision. You have been most helpful, Sir Hector. If I may ask, who else has recently requested access to these materials? Sir Hector hesitated. An inquiry came only a week ago, from a solicitor acting on behalf of a private client. No name was given. The man wore gloves, and he left without giving a forwarding address. Holmes's mouth tightened. I expected as much. As we exited the museum into the noon gloom, Holmes hailed a cab without pause. Where now? I asked, stepping in behind him. To the Earl's residence, or what remains of it. I believe the seal beneath the arch holds more than ashes. Darlington House, once grand, now stood like a relic caught in the teeth of time. Though still stately from the outside, ivy crawling up its stone facade and iron gates rusted but intact. The air around it was one of abandonment. A lone groundsman opened the gate, muttering something about the trust only permitting supervised visits. Holmes showed him a forged letter of inspection, so expertly penned that I marveled once again at the strange arsenal of talents my friend carried beneath his cool demeanor. The Great Hall, if you please, Holmes said, and the man led us through a corridor that smelled faintly of damp stone and furniture polish, long faded. The hall itself was cavernous. Wooden beams soared above us, and a vast fireplace dominated the north wall, framed by an arch of pale grey stone. Dust lay thick upon the hearth, and an iron grate stood cold and unused. Holmes dismissed the groundsman with a polite lie about draft patterns, then knelt before the arch, fingers tracing the stone. There, he said, tapping a small irregularity, a hairline crack that curved into a shallow groove. He withdrew a slender blade from his coat and began to work it gently between two stones. With a faint click, a panel slid inward. Behind it, nestled in a niche no larger than a shoebox, lay a bundle wrapped in blackened cloth. Holmes extracted it carefully. The cloth disintegrated at the edges, revealing a journal bound in cracked leather and sealed with a band of red wax, unbroken. And pinned to the ribbon binding it, another ivory serpent. This one was different. Its eyes were not onyx but garnet, and the tail had been snapped at some point, leaving only a jagged edge. Holmes held it in the light. The original, he said quietly. The rest are imitations, or copies made to pass the burden along. This is what Quentin found reference to. This is what he feared. He broke the seal and opened the first page. Only one sentence was written in a dark, angular hand. He who holds the serpent binds the silence. Break the vow, and fire shall follow. Holmes turned the next few pages, scanning rapidly. The journal documents names, military officials, politicians, even a bishop. Each was sworn to secrecy regarding events at Elmsmere, 1812. There was a fire, a disappearance, and a cover-up that spanned decades. He looked up at me. And here is where it becomes dangerous, Watson. If someone is reviving the pact, retrieving tokens like the scarf pin, then we may already be too late to prevent the next move. As he spoke, a sound echoed faintly through the hall, a soft click, like a boot brushing stone. Holmes froze. We were not alone. Holmes closed the journal at once, his movements silent and economical. He placed it gently inside his coat, then gave me a look that required no words. There was someone nearby. watching us, perhaps listening, possibly armed. The great hall of Darlington House was vast but poorly lit, and the tall arched windows let in little more than a gloomy half-light. Along the east wall hung 3 immense tapestries woven in fading reds and golds, depicting mythic scenes that blurred with age. Knights at battle, a serpent coiled beneath a tree, and a cloaked figure with a lantern kneeling at an altar. Their presence had struck me earlier as merely decorative. Now they seemed like they might conceal more than stories. Holmes stepped away from the fireplace and tilted his head slightly, listening. The sound came again, a soft, deliberate creak, a fraction too controlled to be dismissed as settling timbers. Behind the central tapestry, Holmes whispered. Before I could respond, he had crossed the hall in a flash of motion and, with one swift tug, pulled the fabric away from the wall. Behind it was not a solid wall as expected, but a narrow gallery, a maintenance passage used perhaps by servants in earlier times. The glow of a recently extinguished lantern still lingered in the air. We stepped inside. Weapons drawn, Holmes with his trusted revolver, I with my old service pistol, which I had brought on his instruction that morning. The corridor curved gently, the walls tight and ancient, dust rising around our feet as we moved forward. Halfway down, Holmes paused and crouched. There, impressed in the dust, was the unmistakable imprint of a boot heel, larger than mine, square at the toe and recent. He knew this route, Holmes murmured, and he departed quickly, but not in panic. At the end of the passage, we found a small wooden door. Holmes eased it open and revealed a narrow stairwell spiraling downward into a space that smelled of old soil and decayed wood. We descended slowly, step by cautious step, until we emerged in what must once have been the wine cellar. Row upon row of empty racks greeted us, their contents long removed. At the far end stood a second door, ajar. Holmes stopped just before it, then nodded for me to flank the opposite side. We burst in together. The room beyond was barren save for a single wooden chair, and upon it a folded piece of paper weighed down by a small stone. Holmes retrieved it, scanning the contents with an unreadable expression. "What does it say?" I asked. He handed it to me. "You've found the fire's mouth, but not its teeth. Leave the serpent to sleep, Holmes, or you will feel its bite." There was no signature, only a hand-drawn symbol, an Ouroboros, its head pierced by a pin. Holmes folded the message slowly. "Our visitor is no common thief. He has access to Darlington House, knowledge of its forgotten passages, and a flair for performance. Whoever he is, he wishes to warn us, yet also provoke us. A dangerous combination." We returned to the great hall by a side door and found the groundsman returning, suspicious and red-faced. "I heard something, sir," he stammered, wiping his hands on his coat. "I thought I saw someone running toward the rear gate, but by the time I got there, gone. Not a trace." "Did you glimpse their faces?" "No, sir, just a shape, a tall, long coat moving quick as a fox." Holmes nodded. "Best keep this between us. There may be others who know less than you." We departed without further delay. As our cab rattled through the streets of Westminster, I watched Holmes closely. He had grown unusually still. No finger drumming, no murmured deductions under his breath. I knew from experience this was not weariness, but intense mental effort. At last, he spoke. "Watson, think carefully. The serpent pin, the sealed journal, and the compact, all symbols of a secret passed between hands, across generations. But why now? Why stir the ashes? Quentin Elmhurst believed someone had broken the pact or was trying to, perhaps even with good intention. But his death was the price of trying to pull back the curtain, or perhaps he pulled too hard. He withdrew the journal once more, flipping to a page near the end. "Listen to this." He read aloud. "Simon, Darlington is the last blood heir. He does not know the weight of his inheritance, but I believe he suspects. The envelope I sent him may have ignited what his forebears tried to bury." "Simon Darlington, the current Earl?" I asked. "Precisely. Quentin contacted him, possibly even returned the original pin, and if Lord Darlington has taken any action since, it may not be in alignment with his ancestors' wishes." I frowned. "Do we know where he is?" "According to a footnote Miss Raeburn provided, he maintains a townhouse in Belgrave Square, used intermittently when he's in London." Holmes leaned forward, tapping the roof of the cab. "Driver, Belgrave Square, at once." It was a short ride. The house in question was an imposing structure of pale stone, its windows dark and shuttered. A servant answered the bell, an elderly man with a voice like iron filings. "Lord Darlington is not in residence," he said. "He departed for Paris 5 days ago." "Expected to return?" Holmes asked. "Unknown. He left no schedule." Holmes slipped a card into the man's hand. "Should he return, inform him Mr. Sherlock Holmes requires a word. Urgently." As we turned away, Holmes stopped me with a gesture. "Watson, look, there, the window above the study." I followed his gaze, the faintest flutter of curtain, then stillness. "Someone is there," I said, "watching." "Yes," Holmes replied. "But not the Earl. Whoever it is knows we're drawing closer. They've read Quentin's journal or feared what it contained. This isn't just about a family's shame. It's about power, quiet, ancient, and possibly still active." Back at Baker Street, night had fallen. Holmes took his violin from the case and stood by the fire, his bow poised but unmoving. "The teeth of the fire, Watson," he said softly. "They're not in Darlington House. They're whoever holds the will to act upon its legacy." "And what of the warning? The serpent must sleep." Holmes raised the bow to the strings. "Then let us give it reason to stir." The next morning arrived not with clarity, but with a kind of haunted stillness. A thick fog had wrapped itself around London once more, muffling the clatter of hooves and turning the gas lamps into pale, trembling halos of light. Holmes was already up, reading through Quentin Elmhurst's journal with the intensity of a man tracing invisible ink across a palimpsest. I stirred my tea absently, waiting for his thoughts to take shape into words. At last, they did. "Watson, there is a location that appears throughout this journal, Elmsmere. The name recurs in cryptic references. Listen to this. He who opens the hearth at Elmsmere will find the ember yet warm, and later, the compact's true origin lies not in Darlington House, but in the Red Chapel at Elmsmere." "Elmsmere," I repeated. "Is it a town?" "A manor," Holmes replied, rising to retrieve an old gazetteer from the bookshelf. "A small estate in Wiltshire, held by the Darlington family until 1832. Abandoned following a fire of unknown origin. Quentin's entries suggest he believed the scarf pin, the journal, and the compact all lead back to this place. It may be where the first oath was sworn." "And you believe the truth is still buried there?" "Not buried, sealed, and I intend to unseal it." Within the hour, we were on the train to Wiltshire. Holmes had dispatched a telegram to Miss Raeburn advising her to remain in Hampstead and to trust no strangers, even those claiming to represent the police. He sent a second telegram to Colonel Elmhurst, instructing him to bring any family correspondence referencing Elmsmere to Baker Street for analysis. Holmes, as ever, gave no explanation in his missives, only firm direction. The countryside slid past us in quiet swathes of grey and ochre as the train steamed westward. Holmes remained silent most of the journey, but his fingers tapped a restless code upon his knee, a sure sign his mind was burning through layers of inference. "Elmsmere," he said at last, "was the ignition point. A fire, a disappearance, a pact, and a suppression of truth so thorough that even descendants like Quentin had to dig through ash to find smoke." We arrived just past noon at a small, unmanned station overgrown with ivy. From there, we hired a trap and made our way along a narrow lane toward Elmsmere Hall. The path twisted through thick woodlands, the trees leaning overhead like sentinels. When the house at last came into view, it appeared less a ruin than a scar. Elmsmere Hall stood silent among the bare trees, its front portico crumbling, its upper windows shattered or missing entirely. Weeds had claimed the gravel drive, and the iron gates, long unhinged, lay in the underbrush. Holmes stepped out first, his eyes scanning the structure. "Still intact enough to hide secrets," he murmured. Inside, the air was musty with soot and damp. Charred beams hung like blackened ribs across the ceiling, and the stone walls were stained by old smoke. The drawing room, once grand, had partially collapsed, but Holmes guided us instead toward the chapel, which lay behind the west wing. It was a small, circular chamber, its roof still intact. Faded murals curled along the curved ceiling. One, notably, showed a coiled serpent encircling a scroll, flanked by two robed figures with blank faces. At the far end was the remains of an altar, its surface scorched but undisturbed. Holmes approached it with reverence, running his hands along the edge. Then he knelt and examined the flagstone beneath. "Here," he said, pressing a square tile with his palm. It sank with a grinding click. The altar gave a faint shudder and then shifted, sliding back to reveal a cavity beneath. Within was a sealed metal box, blackened with age. Holmes drew it out, placed it on the cracked pew beside us, and broke the rusted clasp with the edge of his knife. Inside were brittle pages wrapped in oilskin, still legible despite time's efforts. Holmes lifted them gently and began to read. "These are minutes," he said, "from meetings. The compact, their oaths, names of the first initiates. There, Sir Giles Darlington, Colonel Matthew Bligh, Bishop Everard, Lord Stoke. These men used the compact to silence a scandal involving a military atrocity in Spain, carried out under British command, then buried." I leaned over, scanning the words. "To preserve the moral integrity of Britain's post-war image," I read aloud. "Which is to say," Holmes translated, "to ensure the truth never surfaced. They swore to eliminate witnesses, destroy records, and create a legacy so fearsome that none would dare expose it." "And the serpent pin?" Holmes drew it from his pocket and laid it atop the documents. "A token of initiation. A seal passed from one guardian to the next, and if Quentin received the original, it means the chain was broken." Suddenly, we heard it again, the soft scrape of footsteps. Holmes rose at once, motioning me back. A figure appeared in the doorway of the chapel, tall, broad-shouldered, and cloaked in a long black coat. His face was hidden beneath the brim of a dark hat. He did not speak. Holmes addressed him calmly. "You've come to ensure the compact stays buried." Still, the figure remained silent. Then, without a word, he turned and vanished. Holmes darted after him, but by the time we reached the courtyard, he was gone. No sound of horse or carriage, no trace in the mud, only the lingering sense that a shadow had passed through a place it knew well. We returned to the chapel in silence. Holmes gathered the pages, sealing them in a satchel. As we stepped out into the cold Wiltshire air, he paused and looked back at the ruins. "Elmsmere is the beginning," he said, "but it's not the end." As we boarded the train back to London, the weight of what we had uncovered pressed heavily upon us. The serpent was no myth. It had a history, and it had defenders. "The next move?" I asked quietly. Holmes looked out the window as the countryside fell away. "We find Lord Simon Darlington, and we ask him precisely what was in the envelope Quentin sent, before someone silences him as well." Our return to London was quiet, though not restful. Holmes spent most of the train journey seated upright with his eyes closed, his fingers pressed together beneath his chin, as if in prayer. I knew better than to interrupt him. It was in such long, motionless silences that the machinery of his mind worked at its most furious pitch. As dusk approached and the gas lights flickered to life along the city streets, we stepped out of Paddington Station and into the thick breath of the metropolis. The air was sharp with coal smoke and the chill of coming rain. At Baker Street, Mrs. Hudson met us with a letter on a silver tray. It came not half an hour after. "You departed this morning," she said. "A footman delivered it. Said it was from Lord Darlington himself." Holmes took the envelope, his eyes narrowing. It was of thick, cream-colored paper, sealed with a crest, an ivory serpent, identical to the pin, though this one was embossed in wax, the tail curling behind the head. He broke the seal and read silently. I watched the shifting expression on his face, curiosity giving way to something more solemn. Then he handed it to me. It read, "Mr. Holmes, you are correct in assuming I've received what Quentin Elmhurst intended for me. I say intended because when it came, it was not whole. What remains is enough to frighten those who know how to read between the lines. But I tell you this, I never sought it. The compact was never mine to inherit, nor did I ask for the burden that has now crept through my threshold. I am no guardian, Mr. Holmes, but I am being watched, and not only by you. I shall return to London tonight. If you value the truth, and if Quentin's death was no accident, meet me in the reading room of the Lyceum Club precisely at 9:30. Come alone." S.D. Holmes set the letter down on the mantelpiece. "He's frightened, but not enough to run. That tells me he still has something to protect, or something to reveal." "The Lyceum Club?" I asked. "A private venue, discreet, well frequented by those of intellect and influence. There, he may feel he has the upper hand. Are you going alone?" "I shall enter alone," Holmes replied, "but I would prefer that you be within reach. There are shadows gathering, Watson, ones that no candle chases easily." That night, as the city settled into its theatre hours, and the fog coiled through the alleyways like a thing alive, Holmes dressed in dark grey and took only his cane and pocket revolver. I accompanied him as far as the Strand, then circled behind the Lyceum, slipping in through the service alley that Holmes had suggested I use. I took up position near the west-facing window of the reading room, peering through a small break in the curtains. Holmes entered the room a few minutes before the appointed time. The reading room was high-ceilinged, with shelves lining every wall and a large central table beneath a brass chandelier. He selected a chair facing the door and sat with his back straight, hands folded, and the letter from the Earl tucked visibly into his pocket. At precisely 9:30, the door opened. A tall man in his early 40s entered, elegantly dressed, clean-shaven, with angular features and dark, anxious eyes. He carried himself with the grace of a man used to being obeyed, but there was caution in his every step. Lord Simon Darlington. He did not shake Holmes's hand, nor sit immediately. Instead, he walked to the far end of the room as though checking the exits, then turned. "I was warned not to speak to you," he said. "Which is precisely why I have." Holmes offered no greeting. "Who warned you?" "A man who wears no name but carries an ancient threat. You know the type." Holmes gestured to the chair opposite. "Sit, you've begun speaking. You may as well finish." Lord Darlington took the seat, his fingers tapping a nervous rhythm on the armrest. "I received a parcel. Small, wrapped in old silk. No note, no sender. Inside was an ivory pin and 2 pages torn from a journal. One bore the crest of my grandfather. The other detailed something called the Compact. I'd heard whispers of it growing up. Something to do with guarding the family name. But I never imagined it was real." Holmes studied him carefully. "The pages. Did you keep them?" Darlington shook his head. "I burned them the next night. That's when the man began appearing outside my home, standing beneath the lamplight, never approaching, just watching." "A man in a long coat, by chance?" Holmes asked. Yes, always with gloves. Once with a walking stick tipped in ivory. I told no one, not even my solicitor. And then Quentin's death was reported. A heart failure, they said. But I had just written to him, asking for an explanation. Holmes's eyes narrowed. You wrote to Quentin? Yes, a week before his death. I begged him to clarify what the compact was and why I'd been dragged into it. He never replied. Because he was already being hunted, Holmes murmured. Darlington leaned forward. Mr. Holmes, I don't know what the pin truly signifies, but I have reason to believe my grandfather was part of something monstrous. There was a fire at Elmsmere. Yes, I know you've been. I overheard a conversation once as a boy. My father argued with my grandfather about the cost of silence. That's what he called it. He said, the cost of silence must be paid in generations. Holmes stood slowly. You've done the right thing by speaking to me. But you must understand, Lord Darlington, this compact is not merely a collection of frightened old men protecting reputations. It is an inheritance of action. If someone has revived it, they are not content to guard secrets. They are enforcing them. Darlington hesitated. There's more. I almost forgot. 3 days ago, before I left for Paris, someone left a sealed envelope at my private club. It contained only a single phrase and an object. He reached into his coat and produced a small black envelope. Inside was a card with neatly printed words. The serpent has no master, but it does remember. He then placed a second scarf pin onto the table. Identical in shape to the first, but with eyes made not of garnet nor onyx, but of obsidian so dark they seemed to draw in the light around them. Holmes did not touch it. This pin is no mere token, he said. It is a summons. A shadow passed outside the window. I straightened, my hand moving to my pistol. Inside, Holmes turned slightly, eyes flicking toward the glass. I suggest you leave London for a few days, Lord Darlington. Somewhere unannounced. I will inform you when it is safe to return. Darlington nodded, folding the card and pin back into his coat. And if it is never safe? Holmes smiled faintly. Then you will not be the first Darlington to live in exile, but perhaps the first to survive it. Moments later, he stepped out of the club and joined me at the alley corner. Well? I asked. Holmes's face was unreadable. The compact is stirring, and the pins are multiplying, which means the serpent is not content to sleep. We walked quickly into the night, the city pressing in around us. Tomorrow, Holmes said, we would return to Quentin Elmhurst's residence, not for clues, but for something far more dangerous. For the fire, he had tried to extinguish it before it devoured everything. The fog had thickened by morning, clinging low to the streets like a memory too heavy to rise. Holmes and I moved briskly through Kensington, the air damp with the scent of soot and yesterday's coal fires. The cobblestones glistened beneath our boots as we turned once more onto the tree-lined avenue where Colonel Elmhurst's house stood, its windows shuttered, its door grim and still. Holmes had said little over breakfast, save for the occasional murmur as he reread a section of Quentin's journal or compared it against the minutes retrieved from Elmsmere. He had mapped something in his mind, an arrangement of symbols and motives, truths whispered in fire and silence. Today, he intended to test whether the house held more than the surface had yielded. Colonel Elmhurst answered the door himself, looking as though he had not slept. His usually crisp mustache drooped at the corners, and his eyes were hollow with worry. "You received my message?" Holmes asked, stepping inside without waiting. "I did, and I've brought what you asked. All of Quentin's private correspondence is in the study." Holmes gave a curt nod. "Anything that references the fire at Elmsmere, or any letter bearing the crest of the serpent." As we entered the study once more, Holmes paused at the hearth, his eyes lingering not on the ashes, but on the walls, the wainscoting, and the angles of shadow that converged in the corners of the room. "There is something here," he muttered, "something that eluded us before." "Not by accident," but by design. Elmhurst laid out a wooden box on the desk. Inside were envelopes, parchment sheets, and a thin leather-bound address book. Holmes began to sift through them with careful hands. I hovered nearby, scanning what I could. The letters ranged from academic inquiries to obscure references to family estates and private meetings in unnamed locations. But then Holmes stopped. He held up a page, thinner than the rest, folded once with a wax seal broken, but preserved. "There it is," he said softly. A letter from Quentin to his solicitor, dated 2 days before his death. He read aloud, "If something befalls me before this is resolved, I charge you to seek out the sealed envelope marked Ashes in the lower cabinet drawer of my study. Do not break the seal unless Sherlock Holmes himself demands it. It contains not proof, but a path, one I can no longer walk." Holmes turned to the cabinet behind the desk. The drawer in question bore no lock, only a modest brass handle. He opened it and, amid old ledgers and fountain pens, found the envelope in question. It was thick, sealed with red wax, stamped not with a crest, but with a fingerprint. Holmes held it for a moment, weighing it. "A path," he murmured. "Let's see where it leads." He broke the seal and removed the contents. Inside was a charcoal sketch of a symbol, a serpent looped in a figure 8, wrapped around a candelabra. Below it, in Quentin's careful hand, "In the archive beneath the chapel vault, seek the candelabrum. The mechanism is hidden in the wax." "Not Elmsmere," Holmes said. "This refers to the private chapel at Darlington House. Quentin must have discovered a second compartment beneath the vault, accessible only through the ritual elements themselves." Elmhurst paled. "Are you telling me there is more hidden in that place?" "I'm telling you," Holmes replied, "that your brother came within an inch of unlocking something older than this scandal. A legacy. He left us a clue not only to what was buried, but to how to unbury it." Holmes pocketed the sketch and turned to me. "We go now. We'll need lanterns, gloves, and discretion." We returned to Darlington House under the veil of a thickening cloud. The groundsman greeted us with suspicion but made no move to stop us, Holmes's letter of inquiry still holding sway from the earlier visit. Inside, the great hall was darker than before. The fog dimmed even the daylight through the tall windows, and the silence felt heavier. We made our way to the chapel, where the stained glass windows cast no color now, only gray. Holmes approached the altar once more, but this time his focus was not on the stone beneath, but on the candelabrum bolted to the center of the floor. It was made of wrought iron, shaped with twisting coils at the base, and fitted with holders for 7 candles. Holmes inspected it carefully. "Look here, Watson," he said, pointing to one of the candle cups. "The wax around this one hasn't been lit in years, but notice this groove." He slid a thin blade around the inner ring of the holder and twisted gently. With a soft click, the entire candelabrum shifted slightly, then began to lower into the floor. A concealed mechanism released a square hatch beneath it, revealing a narrow stair leading into darkness. "Quentin found this," Holmes said, "but I fear he never descended." Lanterns lit, we entered the passage. The stairs were narrow and steep, carved.
Likeable. It's making you invisible. Think about the people you admire most. Do they agree with everyone? Do they change their positions to fit the room? Do they sacrifice their principles for popularity? Of course not. They stand for something, even when it's difficult. They maintain their positions, even when it's unpopular. They choose their values over their comfort. Your need to be liked by everyone ensures you'll be respected by no one. Your desire to avoid all conflict guarantees you'll win no battles. Your willingness to compromise everything means you'll achieve nothing. Machiavelli understood that, since it is difficult to join them together, it is safer to be feared than to be loved, when one of the two must be lacking. You're so focused on being loved that you've forgotten to be respected. You're so concerned with approval that you've abandoned your integrity. Every time you change your stance to please someone else, you lose a piece of yourself. Every time you pretend to agree when you don't, you become less authentic. Every time you choose harmony over honesty, you choose weakness over strength. People can sense inauthenticity from miles away. They can smell people-pleasing like a predator smells fear. They can see through your desperate need for approval, and it disgusts them. Not because they're cruel, but because humans are biologically programmed to lose respect for those who don't respect themselves. Your principles are not suggestions, they're your foundation. Your values are not negotiable, they're your identity. Your convictions are not conversation starters, they're your strength. Think you've heard the worst of it? Think again. There's something deeper happening here that's been destroying lives for centuries. The Machiavellian Mirror. Why these habits persist. You know what's truly terrifying about these 5 habits? You're not doing them by accident. Society has programmed you to destroy yourself, and you're following the script perfectly. Machiavelli understood something that modern psychology is just beginning to grasp. Men are so simple and so ready to obey present necessities. The present necessity our culture has created is the need to be liked, to fit in, to be seen as good. And that need is killing your potential. Think about it. From childhood, you were rewarded for apologizing quickly, for being available to help others, for not bragging about your achievements, for sharing your feelings, for keeping everyone happy. Every parent, teacher, and authority figure in your life trained you to be weak and called it virtue. They didn't do this maliciously. They genuinely believed they were preparing you for a kind, collaborative world. But that world doesn't exist. The real world operates on Machiavellian principles, whether we acknowledge it or not. The real world rewards strength, values scarcity, respects boundaries, and follows leaders who stand for something. You've been fighting a rigged...
Earlier, I said, you believe someone is deliberately reviving the compact, not just preserving its secrets, but enforcing them once more. Holmes steepled his fingers and regarded the fire. I believe, he said slowly, that someone has stepped forward not merely as custodian of the old order, but as its heir. The 3 scarf pins tell a story, the ivory pins passed as warnings. The golden one, however, bears the authority of the original pact. Whoever sent it intends to act, not merely observe. And Lord Darlington? A reluctant link in the chain. He never wanted the burden, but someone else, someone in the shadows, does. Holmes rose and crossed to the window. The fog clung thick along Baker Street, and yet through the heavy mist I saw a solitary figure standing just beyond the edge of the lamplight, tall, motionless. Holmes did not flinch. There, he said calmly, he returns. I started to rise, but Holmes held up a hand. Number, let him stand. He is not here to strike. Yet. Only to witness. Witness what? The moment when doubt takes root. He wishes us to fear how little we control, and he's partially right. I turned toward the mantel where the golden pin rested. You said it signifies authority, but who would dare to claim it? Holmes returned to the table, picked up the pages recovered from the chapel vault, and began leafing through them. Among these names, he said, is one that has appeared in a different context, connected not to the original compact, but to the recent interest in Quentin's work. A solicitor? One Mr. Leslie Gehring, operating out of Gresham Lane. Quentin corresponded with him several times before his death, though the tone of the letters suggests mistrust. He selected a paper from a separate file. See here. Quentin writes, Gehring is no mere clerk. He carries too much certainty for a man of shadows. I fear he seeks not truth, but confirmation." Holmes looked up at me. "Tomorrow, Watson, we will visit Mr. Goring. I have a feeling we are about to meet a man who no longer considers himself a servant of the compact, but its architect." Gresham Lane was narrow and crooked, hemmed in by stone buildings that seemed to lean inward, as if eavesdropping on those who passed below. At the corner, above a door painted in flaking green, hung a brass plaque, L. Goering-esque. Legal Advisory Services. Holmes rapped smartly on the door, and after a short pause, a tall, hollow-cheeked man of indeterminate age opened it. His gaze was sharp, though not hostile. "Mr. Holmes?" he said without surprise. "And Dr. Watson, of course. I've been expecting you." "Indeed?" Holmes replied. "That shows excellent foresight." "Not foresight," Goring said smoothly. "Only preparation." He stepped aside and motioned us into a narrow, dimly lit office. The curtains were drawn, the desk bare save for a black inkwell and a single wax candle. The air held the scent of old paper and polish. Yet behind it lurked something less pleasant, a trace of iron, of earth. Holmes declined the offered seat and remained standing. "You represented Mr. Quentin Elmhurst?" "In a limited capacity. He engaged me for research assistance, historical permissions, legal filters through family trusts, all very dry. Yet you withheld correspondence from the police following his death." Goring allowed himself a thin smile. "Because I knew they would not understand what they were looking at, nor would they treat it with the seriousness it demands." "And what does it demand?" Holmes asked softly. Goring leaned forward. "Respect. Reverence. A legacy does not die because its members are buried. It evolves. It endures. Through you." A pause. "Through me," Goring replied. "And others who are prepared to do what men like Lord Darlington cannot." Quentin Elmhurst, in his hubris, believed he could break the chain, but he misunderstood. The compact was not a shackle, it was a spine, the moral backbone of an empire built not on laws, but silence. Holmes's voice was calm. "You see yourself as a steward of the empire?" "I see myself," Goring said, "as its last architect. The fire at Elmsmere failed to cleanse what needed to be buried. So now we correct that error." He reached beneath his desk and placed a small wooden box before us. "I know you recovered the golden pin," he said. "That one was meant for you." "For me?" Goring nodded. "You are the last variable, the man who uncovers what others bury, but you are also a man of logic, and logic, Mr. Holmes, must eventually admit what cannot be refuted. The world is held together not by truth, but by structure. The compact provides that structure." Holmes regarded the box without touching it. "And what is this? A gift? A threat?" "A choice," Goring said. "Inside is a token, another pin, black as obsidian. The final color, the final vow. Accept it, and the past is preserved. Decline, and the fire returns. This time with no one left to contain it." I stepped forward. "You murdered Quentin?" "No," Goring said. "I watched him die. There's a difference." Holmes's eyes darkened. "What did he uncover that terrified you?" Goring's voice lowered. "The truth, not about the compact, but about what comes after. There is another layer, Holmes, a deeper pact. Quentin began to understand, but not in time." Holmes reached for the box and opened it. Inside, nestled on black velvet, was a scarf pin shaped not as a serpent, but as a flame. Holmes closed the lid. "I have no use for heirlooms, especially those forged in threats." He turned and walked out. I followed, Goring's voice chasing us as we reached the door. "When the next fire comes, Holmes, don't say you weren't offered the match." Back at Baker Street,
setting a silver tray of tea with mechanical precision. Her composure had returned, but I noted a faint tremor in her hand as she set down the sugar bowl. Holmes wasted no time. Mrs. Pinter, you failed to mention George's artistic inclinations. You also neglected to inform us of your argument with him. Her expression tightened. I did not believe it relevant. Everything is relevant, Holmes replied sharply. Did George suspect anything unusual in this household? She hesitated, then sighed. He did. He said he'd seen someone outside the house late at night. A man with Mr. Lavington's build. Said he thought the master was sleepwalking or haunted. But then, he told me he saw them both, in the same place, at the same time. Both? She nodded. Mr. Lavington and the other man. They passed each other in the hall, he said. And the resemblance was... Her voice trailed off. Holmes leaned forward. He told you this directly? Yes. 2 nights ago. He was frightened. Said he was thinking of leaving. I advised him to stay, only until someone like you could look into it. Holmes turned to me with a grim expression. Watson, what would you say to a man who claims to see his employer walking both up and down the same hallway in the same moment? I'd suspect either trickery or madness. Precisely. And I suspect the former. At that moment, a bell sounded from the front of the house. The doorbell. A visitor. Mrs. Pinter excused herself, and moments later returned with a man of middle years, dressed in a dark overcoat and cap, raindrops still clinging to his collar. He looked surprised to find the drawing room occupied. This is Mr. Lane, Mrs. Pinter announced. He's from the solicitor's office in Oxford. Mr. Lavington requested a document delivered. Holmes stepped forward. May I inquire what document? Lane blinked, startled by the tone. It's a revised will, sir. Mr. Lavington asked for it to be witnessed by 2 members of the household. He signed it yesterday morning, and we returned it today for final approval. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Revised will? Do you know the nature of the changes? I'm not at liberty to discuss its contents, sir, Lane said, clearly uncomfortable. Holmes turned to Margaret, who had followed us into the room. Were you aware your father altered his will yesterday? She shook her head. He didn't tell me. Holmes's expression grew darker still. This was not merely a haunting. Someone here stands to benefit from Mr. Lavington's confusion, either by impersonation or erasure. Suddenly, heavy steps pounded down the main staircase. It was Lavington himself, pale, dishevelled, clutching the banister as though he'd seen a ghost. Holmes! Watson! Come quickly! There's someone in the old cellar. I saw a light. It vanished the moment I looked down. Holmes reacted instantly, snatching a lantern from the E.
Press. Press. He sent a separate packet, sealed and unopened, to be published only if he failed to leave the building after the service. They may attempt subtlety, Holmes remarked as we prepared to leave. But subtlety will not serve them well. They're afraid, Watson. That is why they watch. That is why they wait. And if fear becomes desperation, then they act rashly, which in our case may be the only chance we have. The Stratford Rooms sat nestled between a tobacconist and a tailor's shop, its arched windows veiled with velvet drapes. Inside, the room was modest but refined. Dark wood paneling, oil lamps glowing on the walls, and rows of chairs set before a single raised dais. No flowers adorned the space, no music played. At the front, only a framed photograph of Quentin sat atop a black cloth-draped pedestal, his face composed and distant, as if still waiting to be understood. Guests arrived quietly. Colonel Elmhurst entered first, clad in full black, his expression unreadable. He nodded once to Holmes and took his place in the front row. Miss Raeburn followed, wearing a veil, though her eyes shone clear and fierce beneath it. Lord Darlington came last, arriving alone, his face pale, his manner strained. He took a seat at the rear, away from the others. A few journalists entered after him, scribbling, observing, waiting. Holmes took the dais precisely at noon. He stood without notes, his lean frame straight, his voice even as it echoed across the quiet room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "you are not gathered today to mourn the loss of a man, but to confront the danger of what he died to uncover. Quentin Elmhurst was a historian, but more than that, he was a seeker of truth. In an age where truth is obscured by reputation and ceremony, such a man is a threat." Murmurs passed through the crowd. Colonel Elmhurst leaned forward, his brows furrowed. Holmes continued. He discovered a legacy, buried in fire and bound by oath. A compact forged during the Napoleonic Wars, when the moral credibility of a nation was thought more valuable than justice itself. Those who formed this compact silenced enemies, witnesses, and even allies to maintain the illusion. Their seal was a serpent, their symbol a pin. Holmes withdrew the golden scarf pin from his coat pocket and held it up. One of three. Passed not to preserve tradition, but to control narrative. Quentin received one. It marked him, and then it killed him. A sharp intake of breath echoed from the back. Before his death, Holmes went on, he uncovered letters, rituals, and names. They were sealed, then buried. But the truth does not remain buried. It waits, coiled, beneath the hearth, and now it stirs. Holmes placed the golden pin on the pedestal beside Quentin's photograph. I will not name the men behind the current revival of this compact. Yet, but they are here, watching, listening, perhaps even among us. All heads turned subtly. I noted a man in the corner, unknown to either Holmes or myself, his gloved hands folded too tightly, his coat too new for mourning. Holmes concluded, "This gathering is your warning. The compact is not a whisper of the past. It is a voice growing louder, but no longer unchallenged. You will read it, you will know it, and it will not pass quietly into the next generation." He stepped down. The room was silent. Then, one by one, people began to stand, not in applause, but in acknowledgement. Colonel Elmhurst stood and bowed his head. Miss Rayburn pressed her hand to her chest. Even Lord Darlington, visibly shaken, remained in place, his eyes fixed on the pin. But the man in the corner did not move. Holmes approached him slowly. "You've heard enough?" he asked. The man said nothing, but his lips curled faintly, neither in approval nor disdain. Then he turned and left. Holmes watched him go, then turned to me. "He will report this, and they will respond." That night we returned to Baker Street under a sky stripped bare of fog. The moon hung clear and pale, and for once the city breathed evenly. Inside, Holmes paced. "They will not attack in daylight. They have no interest in spectacle. But now that I've spoken, they must either discredit me or eliminate the evidence." He glanced to the cabinet where the documents from Elmsmere were now stored beneath lock and key. "We'll be targeted next," I said. He nodded. "But not here, not immediately. No, there's one more place they must visit first. The place where Quentin began." I frowned. "The archives?" "Exactly," Holmes said. "The Earl of Darlington's private archive. If Goering and his circle intend to erase the trail, they'll do so at the source." He turned to me. "We leave before dawn, and we do not go alone." We left Baker Street well before first light, moving through streets still glazed with the remnants of the night's dew. The carriage Holmes had arranged, a discreet brougham driven by a man in his employ, carried us southward through London's quiet arteries, passing beneath the veiled arches of railway bridges and through narrow lanes where the gas lamps burned low, their flames trembling in the early hush. Neither of us spoke until the city had slipped behind, replaced by the skeletal forms of hedgerows and the ghostly outlines of sleeping fields. Dawn had not yet broken, but the sky had begun to pale in the east. Holmes finally stirred, shifting in his seat. "Watson, do you remember the ledger we recovered from the Elmsmere vault?" "Of course." There was a mention of the original compact materials, papers, testimonies, oaths, being duplicated and sealed not only at Elmsmere, but in a secondary location known only to the founding signatories and their heirs. And you believe that location is the Darlington Private Archive? Holmes nodded. It was, built into the west wing of the house under the guise of an expansion library, but Quentin's notes suggest otherwise. He references an architectural sketch showing an underground chamber beneath the book stacks, accessible only via a mechanical lock disguised as a filing drawer. It was his intention to investigate it, but he was intercepted. I looked out at the road unwinding before us. You think Garing will try to destroy what's inside? I'd wager he's already tried once. But without the cipher key, Quentin's key, he couldn't open it. And now? Now, Holmes said, producing a small brass instrument from his coat pocket. We have what he didn't. Darlington House stood still and solemn in the morning mist, its great facade shrouded by the heavy quiet of early light. The windows were dark. The gatekeeper's post was unmanned. We stepped from the carriage, lanterns in hand, and approached the west wing. A set of ivy-draped steps led us down to the side entrance Holmes had located in Quentin's journal. A servant's door, long disused, its rusted hinges groaning faintly as we passed through. Inside, the air was thick with dust and age. The corridor opened into a narrow gallery lined with floor-to-ceiling shelves, every inch packed with volumes in varied states of decay. A scattering of papers lay on the floor, and a small oil lamp, long extinguished, rested on a side table near the stacks. Holmes moved directly to the far corner of the room, where a mahogany filing drawer protruded slightly from the rest, worn with use but no different in appearance from the others. "This is it," he said. He crouched, examined the brass handle, then inserted the cipher key, a flat, ridged rod with 3 rotating rings at its base, into a slot beneath the drawer. There was a click. The drawer sank slightly inward. Then the entire panel shifted backward and to the left, revealing a descending stairwell, dark as pitch and wrapped in stone. Holmes lit his lantern. "Stay close." We descended. The passage was narrow and steep, the walls damp and cold. A slow trickle of water echoed somewhere in the depths. At the bottom, we found a thick wooden door, iron-bound and sealed with a lock unlike any I'd seen, an interlocking disc mechanism marked with symbols from the Darlington crest. Holmes aligned the symbols according to a sketch he had deciphered from Quentin's journal: serpent, flame, and scroll, and the door groaned open. What lay beyond was a chamber, square and austere, lined with black shelving and iron cabinets. A long table stood in the center, empty save for a sealed chest bearing the crest of the compact. Several filing crates sat in corners, their contents undisturbed. But we were not alone. A man stood at the far end of the chamber. He turned slowly as the door opened wider, revealing a familiar silhouette, tall, broad, gloved. Leslie Garing. "Mr. Holmes," he said, calmly. "I suspected you'd come." Holmes stepped into the room, a lantern raised. "Your foresight, Mr. Garing, is impressive. Your timing, however, is unfortunate." Garing moved away from the cabinet he had been inspecting. "I had no intention of hiding. This place, this archive, is a sanctum, but now it has become something else entirely, a battlefield." "And you mean to be its custodian?" Holmes asked. "I mean to be its judge," Garing replied. "These papers, these records, they're poison, Holmes, to the empire, to history. If the public knew what these men did, how they secured peace, it would unravel everything. Trust in the crown, faith in institutions. You would trade centuries of order for a headline." Holmes stepped closer, his eyes hard. Number Famois would trade generations of silence for a single moment of truth. "Then we are at an impasse," Garing said. "You forget," Holmes replied. "I don't intend to debate you." With swift precision, he reached for the compact chest and, using a small key retrieved from the golden pin, unlocked it. Inside were pages wrapped in oilskin, sealed with a faded crest. Holmes lifted the topmost document and read aloud. By this pact, signed in witness of sovereign duty, we bind ourselves to the compact to secure not power, but permanence, not justice, but judgment. Signed, Sir Giles Darlington, Lord Stoke, Bishop Everard, General Bligh, and others. He handed it to me. Proof, at last. Gehring stared, unmoved. You've crossed a line, Holmes. This cannot be allowed to surface. And yet, Holmes said, here we are. Suddenly, from behind one of the shelves, two more figures emerged. I recognized one as the man from the memorial service, the silent observer in the dark coat. The second was unknown, but equally expressionless. Both wore gloves. Neither spoke. Gehring turned to them. Take it. Holmes backed toward me. Not yet, he whispered. With remarkable speed, he dropped his lantern to the floor, shattering the glass. The flame burst across the oil-soaked stone, igniting into a wall of fire that separated us from the advancing men. Watson, now! We sprinted for the stairwell, Holmes clutching the sealed journal and several pages from the archive. Behind us, smoke rose and flames licked upward. Holmes slammed the outer door behind us and jammed a heavy beam across the threshold. The fire would burn the oil, but the stone would not yield. We emerged into the pale light of dawn, breathless. From within, no sound came. Holmes exhaled. They came to destroy, but they arrived too late. We have what we need. And them? I asked. They'll flee or vanish or lie low, but they won't return here. The fire has already been lit. Back at Baker Street, Holmes laid the recovered documents across the table with great care. Miss Rayburn arrived shortly after, as requested, and Colonel Elmhurst soon followed. We showed them the truth, unredacted, undeniable. And then Holmes addressed them both. The compact no longer has only keepers. It has witnesses, and now it has a choice. Fade with dignity, or be dragged into the light. Miss Rayburn looked at the golden pin on the mantel. What happens now? Holmes folded his hands. Now, we finish what Quentin Elmhurst began. It was late afternoon when the telegram arrived. The paper was damp with drizzle, the ink slightly blurred, but the message was unmistakable. Holmes unfolded it with deliberate slowness, read it silently, and handed it to me. From the Times, I said aloud. Mr. Quentin Elmhurst's memorial address has stirred inquiry. Editors seek verification of referenced compact documents, requesting interview with Mr. Holmes or representatives. I looked up from the page. They're listening now, I said. Holmes nodded. And watching, which means we must tread carefully, but not quietly. We were in the sitting room, the table covered with documents from the Darlington archive, oaths, signatures, transcripts, and symbols. Miss Rayburn sat in the armchair opposite Holmes, her hands folded neatly in her lap, though her eyes were alert, moving from parchment to parchment as if scanning the very bones of the past. Colonel Elmhurst stood by the window, his silhouette sharp against the fading daylight. Holmes crossed to the fireplace and retrieved the 3 pins, ivory, gold, and black, and placed them one by one atop the journal from Elmsmere. Symbols of continuity, he said, passed hand to hand like a ritual, and with each passage, responsibility, real or imagined, was transferred. The compact survived because it was never held by any one man for long. It was always about the role, never the person. But now, Miss Rayburn said, it's collapsed into a single moment. No more passing, no more hiding. What you have is final. Holmes gave a slight nod. The last seal is broken, he said, almost to himself, and that changes everything. There was a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered moments later, her expression taut with the effort of composure. There's someone downstairs, she said. He says his name is Jonathan Gray. He claims to have known Mr. Quentin Elmhurst Holmes, and I exchanged a glance. Send him up, Holmes said. A few moments passed, and the man entered, a younger figure than expected, perhaps 30, with a well-fitted coat and ink stains on his fingers. He removed his hat slowly and looked around the room with the cautious deference of someone entering a library during a funeral. I thank you for receiving me, he said. My name is Jonathan Gray. I was Mr. Elmhurst's assistant at King's College. Holmes motioned him to sit. You have something to share? Gray hesitated, then reached into his coat and produced a sealed envelope, yellowed with age. He left this with me the day before he died. Told me to deliver it only if certain conditions were met. This morning, I read the Times. I believe the condition has been fulfilled. Holmes accepted the envelope and broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet. On it were words written in Quentin's hand. If Holmes has this, he will already have understood the structure, but not the fulcrum. The compact was not merely a system of secrecy, it was an agreement of survival. The pact did not serve to protect power, it served to preserve one man. Holmes looked up slowly. One man? Gray nodded. Quentin believed that all of it, the fire at Elmsmere, the buried archives, the passing of pins, was ultimately to protect a single identity. Someone thought they were lost, forgotten by history. I felt my blood chill. Who? Holmes returned his gaze to the paper. Beneath Quentin's final line was a name, barely legible. Sir Percival Lee. The name meant nothing to me, but Holmes stood abruptly, moved to his desk, and began rummaging through the papers from Elmsmere. At last, he pulled free a brittle letter. This name appears here, he said, tapping the corner of the page, but it's crossed out, replaced with an alias. He was a British officer stationed in Cadiz during the final months of the war, alleged to have defected, only to vanish days later after a massacre at a Spanish convent. What did Quentin believe? I asked. That Lee never defected, Holmes said, but instead carried out the atrocity under direct instruction, an operation never sanctioned by Parliament. The compact was formed not merely to bury the event, but to erase his identity, preserve his lineage, and protect anyone bearing his bloodline. Miss Rayburn paled slightly. Lord Darlington, she whispered. Holmes nodded. The current Earl is his great-grandson, through an unrecorded line, which means the compact was formed to preserve a name, I said, astonished, not a principle. To preserve a single man's legacy, at the cost of truth, Holmes said, and to protect his descendants from scandal or worse. That is why Darlington was sent the pin. That is why Goering tried to silence him, because Simon Darlington is the last link. Colonel Elmhurst stepped forward. And what do we do with that knowledge now? Holmes was silent for a moment. Then he turned back to the table. We prepare. The next day, Holmes compiled a full dossier of the compact, carefully omitting names of the descendants, but retaining all founding details, signatures, and symbols. He included the oath texts and transcripts from Elmsmere, alongside the partial records found in the chapel vault. Then he handed it to Miss Rayburn. You will publish it, he said, in serialized form, as fiction if necessary. But you must control the narrative before someone else distorts. Rayburn took it solemnly. And Lord Darlington? I will speak with him, Holmes said. Privately. We met the Earl in Hyde Park, near the Serpentine, under the wide canopy of chestnut trees where the fog still lingered between branches. Lord Simon Darlington looked older than he had a week ago. The weight of inheritance had found him. Holmes offered no pleasantries. You are the last, he said. Darlington gave a tired smile. I never asked to be. Nor did Quentin, but he carried the truth nonetheless. The Earl looked out across the water. So now what? Am I to be tried in the court of memory? No, Holmes said, but you must let it end with you. The Earl nodded slowly. I have no heirs. That may be the final mercy. Holmes turned away, then leave the fire buried, and let it warm no more. That evening, back at Baker Street, Holmes lit a single candle on the mantelpiece and placed the 3 pins before it. Ivory, gold, black. He sat in silence as the flame flickered, casting strange shadows across the walls. I stood beside him, watching the shapes twist and stretch. At last, he spoke. The compact survived because men feared history more than they feared injustice. That time has passed. He rose, took the pins and placed them in a small wooden box. Then, without a word, he locked the box, sealed it, and handed it to me. "For your medical bag," he said. I took it, uncertain. "Why me?" "Because if it ever resurfaces," he said softly, "it will mean the patient is very, very ill.